chapter 16 is a big one. There's a lot happening. So now we're coming to the death of Samson. So let's start reading, picking up in verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hand." So here we have the lords of the Philistines. Remember, these are the 5 guys from verse 5 who approached Delilah and asked for her help in capturing Samson. Notice that they are worshiping and rejoicing to Dagon. They needed help from a woman to capture Samson, but they don't want anyone to know that. So they're turning it all and saying, look at our God Dagon gave us Samson. They're not giving any credit to Delilah at all. So now all the people are going to show up. Verse 24, when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." They're bringing their offerings and their praise and all of their worship to Dagon. And these things should be reserved for God alone. I can't help wonder how many of us might be doing the same thing, like giving credit to our own strength, our own little gods, our own wit, believing that the situation, how it worked out, was just coincidence rather than God's providence. God should be the recipient of all of our praise all the time. If we've got breath in our lungs, we should have praise on our lips. Verse 25, and when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." So when they call him out, some translations say that he performed for them, and other translations say that he made them sport. So in the sense of him performing, he would have been made to dance or do something with his body that would have been meant to humiliate himself, something that they could laugh at, right? Something that they could mock and ridicule and just tear him down for. The other is that they made him sport, which means they brought him out there just so that they could laugh at him, just so that they could ridicule him, just so that they could look at him and jeer at him and maybe throw things at him. They were entertained by just seeing Samson up there looking miserable, looking weak. It says when their hearts were merry. So they've been drinking, and that's when they decide to bring him out. They're getting belligerent, they're getting crude, they're getting offensive. And Samson is standing there, taking it, doing what he's told to do. He is accepting his punishment for his sin. He recognizes his sin and where it's gotten him. And yet in this moment, he's still thinking of a way to deliver Israel. And we see that there's a guide with him, and this guide almost feels sorry for him in a way. I mean, you can kind of assume that, because when Samson says, "Hey, can you just put me somewhere that I can rest?" the young man obliges his request. So he's standing in between these 2 pillars. Remember, he's blind. So when he asks the guy, like, "Hey, can you just lead me somewhere so I can lean up against a wall or something?" He leans up against this pillar and he feels the pillar. He stretches out his hands and he can feel both pillars. So he's worn out from this emotional mockery as well as the physical demands that they're probably making him do. And it's only when he finds his rest between these pillars that he's given an idea of how he might redeem Israel. And for us today, when we seek God's presence, even if we have been living a life of sin, when we turn from that and seek God's presence, we acknowledge our sin, we lay it before him, we ask him to forgive us, and we want to press into his presence, and we want to find our rest in him. When we do that, he puts on our hearts what we need to do next. When we're trying to figure out what to do next and we can't sleep because we're laying awake thinking about a situation or a decision that we need to make, get in God's presence as fast as you can and just find your rest in him. Because that's the only time and space that God can talk to you when you're in a season like that. The only time God is going to talk to you is when you are pressing in to his word, through prayer, through song, through meditation, through reading the scripture. That's when God's going to speak. So Samson is finding his rest between these 2 pillars, and God lays on his heart what he can do next. Verse 27, now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. We see again who was at this joyous gathering. It's the 5 lords of the Philistines and about 3,000 men and women. Now, usually the Bible only mentions men, and here we read about women as well. We're going to hang on to that for just a second. Okay, verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. This is either a mental prayer or spoken just between him and God, but I love this verse for the same reason I love Nehemiah 2:4. It's just a quick, silent prayer before the Lord, calling out from a heart that truly desires God's will. And those kind of prayers will always reach heaven. And this is part of what it means to pray without ceasing. When we've spent time with the Lord on a continual basis, daily, often, all the time, then we can offer up these quick, short prayers in a moment of urgency. When we offer those quick, short prayers, it's from a heart that's already connected to God. It's when we do the short little prayers all the time, there's never any substance, or we do the long, drawn out prayers with a lot of words that don't amount to anything. We do it once or twice a month. Like, both of those don't work. Our heart needs to be connected to God so that in a long prayer or a short prayer, God hears our heart because we're connected to Him. We know what it feels like to have that one friend who only texts you or calls you when they need something every few months. It's like you see the text or you see the phone call and you're like, they're going to ask me for something. Like, this isn't going to be a fun conversation for me. I already know. Like, we don't want to do that with God, right? So God answers this prayer from Samson because he is truly recognizing that his strength has been from God all along. And now Samson is begging for one last triumphant moment, a moment that he knows will bring his death. And Samson here, and this is how Samson represents a Christ type. He's a deliverer that sacrifices his own life to save God's people. Now, the big difference is Christ was without sin and Samson wasn't. But the Bible uses Samson's story to reveal how the coming Christ, the coming Messiah, is going to save his people through his death. Verse 29. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his lifetime. These pillars are close enough together for him to stretch out his hands and touch either side. And now he says out loud with this loud cry, "Let me die." I mean, his adrenaline is pumping. God's strength is just surging through his body. He takes the whole thing down. And the Bible said that the number he killed here was greater at his death than it was while he was alive. God set this up. God planned for Samson to be this mighty threat to the Philistines. And just when they thought they had him in their grasp, when he was blinded and bound, when they thought they had won, Samson takes everything down. And now let's go back to where it mentions men and women. One scholar points out that Samson's weakness was his lust for women. And we only read about 3 prostitutes or women that he had encounters with, but Samson was drawn to the Philistine women. And now we see all of the women who had once enticed him are now being taken down in a pile of rubble. And I love that picture because when we let go of our sin and when we rest in God's presence, the things that deceived us before, the things that tripped us up, the things that caused us so much trouble in our past, they no longer have a hold on us. They become just dust under our feet. So this is why the people are all there to celebrate Samson, to mock Samson, and now Samson has just taken everything down. God will not be mocked. God set this whole thing up. God was still in control of this situation, and God is still in control of our situations now. Even when our world feels crazy and wacky and out of control, God is still in control. So speaking of this building, it wasn't meant to support so much weight, and we can picture it kind of collapsing in on itself as Samson takes out these 2 main support beams. And there isn't any part of this in which God's hand wasn't orchestrating it. As I mentioned just a second ago, he brought all these people together to be at the same place at the same time for this moment right now. God allowed Samson to release God's own vengeance on the Philistines for the Israelites. And before we say how cruel God is for allowing all of these people to die, let's remember that we're all going to be judged for the works that we've done on this earth. In our life, whether good or bad, 2 Corinthians 5:10 says that we must all stand before Christ to be judged. Each of us will receive what we should get, good or bad, for the things that we do in this earthly body. Everyone's going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of what they did. If there was anyone in this crowd who loved the Lord and who obeyed his commands, and he died in this spectacle, then he received his reward. Likewise, those in the crowd who hated God and disobeyed his commandments, they were judged accordingly, and they received what they earned. Verse 31, then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. His brothers and all his family came and searched through the rubble until they found his body, and they gave him a proper burial with his father Manoah. And I picture this scene with not only Samson's family, but also many of the Philistines who had lost family members in this disaster. They're so solemn that they don't even say one word to the Israelites there. Can you imagine how these Israelites felt as they walked over the ruins of this temple, this great temple of their enemy? Like, what a moment, what a victory. And we can have that kind of victory too, walking over what was once a snare and a trap to us, tormenting us and making us feel worthless. We can walk over those things as stones, and we can have that kind of victory too. Walking over what was once a snare and a trap to us, tormenting us and making us feel worthless, those things can become stones and dust under our feet. Because when we walk with Jesus, we overcome with Jesus. And that changes everything.